Okay, let's set the scene. It's August 25th, 1944. Cherbourg Harbor, Normandy. You really need to picture this. General Patton's Third Army. Well, they've just pulled off this incredible breakthrough.
Just astonishing speed. They're racing across France, sometimes covering 50, 60, maybe even 80 miles in a single day.
But that speed, that very success,
Mhm.
has created this huge, unprecedented problem, a logistical nightmare, really.
Exactly. They've outrun their supply lines
Yeah.
by about 400 miles, which is just, it's massive. They're grinding to a halt.
Running out of everything. Gas, ammo, the whole spearhead of the Allied invasion is basically running on empty.
It's the classic paradox, isn't it? You
Ah.
win so decisively on the battlefield that you create this massive strategic headache behind the lines.
Yeah, and the chance to maybe even end the war in 44 to keep the pressure on the Wehrmacht, it all suddenly depends on something really basic.
Getting supplies forward. Millions of gallons of fuel, tons and tons of ammunition, moving it all from the beaches way back in Normandy up to the front. And for that, you needed one thing above all else.
Trucks. Lots and lots of trucks.
And specifically, we're talking about the humble workhorse, the 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, or the Deuce and a half, as everyone called it.
Right, and here's the kicker, the real irony we want to dig into today. Just 4 years before this, back in 1940, the British military tested this truck's design.
They did. And their assessment was brutal. They called it flawed, underpowered, even worthless for modern mechanized warfare.
Worthless. But flash forward to 44, and suddenly it's the linchpin of the entire Allied advance.
They couldn't have been more wrong.
Yeah.
Fundamentally wrong. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack exactly why. How did this, seemingly ordinary mass-produced truck become the absolute backbone of the Red Ball Express, the most critical supply run of the war?
And we absolutely have to talk about the people involved, the drivers. Because it took around 6,000 of these trucks pulled together for this almost impossible task.
Driven mostly by African-American soldiers, about 75% of the drivers came from segregated quartermaster units.
And they took this truck, the one initially dismissed, and turned it into this incredible logistical victory against all odds. We're going to explore how just being adequate but available in huge numbers was actually way more important than having the fanciest tank or plane.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start with the truck itself. Why did it get such a bad rap initially? And what changed?
So the story really starts back in 1939. The U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, they saw the writing on the wall. Future wars weren't going to be fought just with horses.
Right. Mobility was key. So they put out a requirement for a new kind of truck, a medium tactical truck.
The specs were pretty clear. Needed to carry 2.5 tons, had to have six-wheel drive, so 6x6, and crucially, it needed to handle off-road conditions. They wanted something tough.
And General Motors, their truck and coach division up in Pontiac, Michigan, they stepped up. But, and this is important, they didn't start from a blank sheet.
No, what did they do?
They went for speed and efficiency. They basically took existing commercial truck parts from their standard Act series and adapted them. It was about getting something out there quickly.
Okay, so the first version, that was the ACK WX353, right? And you can kind of see that commercial heritage when you look at pictures.
Definitely. It had a closed steel cab like any delivery truck of the time, fixed cargo bed, long wheelbase for stability on, American roads. It looked like a civilian truck painted olive drab.
But the engine, that seems to have been the real issue.
That was the heart of the problem. It used a GMC 248 cubic inch inline six, and it only produced, wait for it, 77 horsepower.
77, for a truck that weighed nearly 5 tons empty.
Exactly. Almost 10,000 pounds before you put a single bullet or can of fuel in it, then add the 2.5-ton payload. 77 horsepower was just, well, it was asking for trouble.
Sounds like trying to tow a boat with a scooter. Was it completely useless or just not right for Europe?
That's the key question, isn't it? On a nice paved highway, maybe it was okay. Slow, but okay.
Yeah.
But for the kind of terrain they expected in Europe, muddy fields, narrow village streets, hills, it was a potential disaster.
And some of these actually saw service before the design changed.
Yeah, about 2,000 of them were delivered to France before the Blitzkrieg in 1940. And of course, most were immediately captured by the Germans.
Oh, wow. Did the Germans use them?
They did. Ironically, German truck production was pretty limited, so they pressed almost anything captured into service. Reports indicate German drivers found them reliable, surprisingly so, especially on the Eastern Front. But they definitely agreed they were slow. Really slow.
So tough but underpowered. But the real nail in the coffin for that early design came from the British tests in the summer of 1940.
Right. The British were desperate for equipment and started rigorously testing potential American vehicles. and their reports on the ACKWX were absolutely scathing.
What were their main complaints? Focused on Europe, I assume?
Entirely. They flagged three major problems. First, the wheelbase. Too long, they said. Made it clumsy on tight European roads and farm tracks. Hard to maneuver.
Okay, maneuverability. Makes sense. And the engine. That's 77 horsepower.
It failed miserably under load, especially on hills. It wasn't just slow acceleration, it couldn't maintain speed or power on gradients, which led directly to the third big flaw.
Let me guess. Getting stuck.
Bingo. Marginal performance in soft terrain. Mud, sand. Even with 6x6, if that truck lost momentum, that little 77 horsepower engine just didn't have the low-end grunt, the torque to pull itself out.
So slow, hard to turn, and prone to getting bogged down. Yeah, I can see why they concluded it was unsuitable for modern mechanized warfare.
Based on those tests, yeah, it seemed like a fair judgment. And the British acted on it. They diverted a huge batch, about 1,000 of these trucks, over to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease in '41. Basically pawned them off.
Okay, so GMC is facing a major problem. Their first attempt is seen as a failure. War is looming. They need a redesign. Fast. But they can't start over completely.
No time for that. And this is where the engineers made a really smart, pragmatic shift in thinking. They realized the goal wasn't to build the perfect truck, the ultimate off-roader.
What was the goal then?
Adequacy. And numbers. Lots and lots of numbers. They needed a truck that was good enough, simple to build, simple to fix, and could be produced on an absolutely massive scale. Availability became the priority.
And that led to the CCKW redesign in 1941. Let's break down that name again for listeners. CCKW.
Right, so C for the year, 1941 design. The second C means conventional cab. K stands for all-wheel drive. And W indicates dual tandem rear axles. Simple, descriptive.
And the changes they made weren't revolutionary, but they were crucial. The biggest one had to be the engine, right? Solving that power deficit.
Absolutely critical. They put in a new engine.
Yeah.
The GMC 270 cubic inch inline six. This was the game changer.
How much difference did it make technically?
It was significant. Power jumped from that weak 77 horsepower up to 104 horsepower. That's nearly a 35% increase. Sounds okay, but the real magic was the torque.
Torque. Explain why that was so important for this truck's job.
It produced 216 foot-pounds of torque, and crucially, it did it at a very low engine speed, just 1,400 RPM. That's the pulling power you need right when you step on the gas.
So for getting unstuck from mud or hauling heavy loads up steep hills?
Exactly. You don't need high revs, you need that instant grunt. That low-end torque meant the difference between grinding to a halt and keeping the supplies moving. It fundamentally changed the truck's capability off-road and under load.
They also introduced some flexibility, didn't they? With different wheelbases.
Yeah, that was smart.
Yeah.
They offered two main versions. The CCKW 352, which had a shorter 145-inch wheelbase, often used for things like artillery prime movers, and the standard CCKW 353 cargo version with the longer 164-inch wheelbase.
Using the same basic chassis and engine for different roles, that must have simplified things.
Massively, especially for spare parts and maintenance training. And speaking of simplifying, wartime shortages actually pushed them towards even more simplification, like the cab design.
Ah, the famous open cab with the canvas top. That started in July 1943. Was that just about saving money?
It was primarily about saving strategic materials. Switching from the closed steel cab to the open canvas top saved about 150 pounds of steel per truck.
150 pounds doesn't sound like much, but when you're building hundreds of thousands.
Exactly. It adds up incredibly fast. That steel that could go into tanks, ships, planes. It was a wartime economy decision. Driver comfort took a backseat to production speed and material conservation.
So the design philosophy really was make it adequate, make it simple, make it fast, and make a lot of them.
That's the essence of the CCKW's success. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't the best performing truck on paper in every category, but it was good enough, easy to fix, and crucially, it could be churned out on an industrial scale nobody had ever seen before.
Okay, let's talk about that scale. Because massive almost doesn't do it justice. The sheer industrial power the U.S. brought to bear is mind-boggling.
It really is. The main contract was with Yellow Truck and Coach in Pontiac, but Chevrolet's plant in St. Louis also built huge numbers. And these factories, they weren't just building trucks, they were operating like clockwork.
What was the peak production rate? Give us that number again.
At the absolute peak, across the GM plants involved, a new GMC CCKW truck was rolling off an assembly line, ready to go, every 7 minutes.
Yeah, every 7 minutes.
Around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just imagine that relentless output. It changes the entire equation of military logistics.
That kind of production, it just dwarfs what anyone else was doing, right?
Yeah.
How many did they make in total?
Between 1941 and 1945, GM produced roughly 562,750 CCKWs in all its different versions. The standard cargo truck accounted for somewhere around 518,000 or 519,000 of those.
562,000. How does that compare to, say, the Axis powers?
It completely eclipses them. Germany, for all its engineering prowess, only managed to produce about 100,000 trucks of all types combined during that same period. The Soviet Union may be closer to 200,000.
So this one American truck model, the CCKW, outnumbered the entire truck production of Germany and nearly tripled the Soviet output.
Basically, yes. More than Germany and Japan combined by a huge margin. That's what industrial might looks like. Remember that standardization.
The common chassis, engine, parts.
Huge advantage. Need a tanker, need a wrecker, mobile workshop, ambulance. They could quickly adapt the production line because the core vehicle was the same. Spare parts became much easier to manage globally.
So America built this incredible fleet of trucks, but having the trucks sitting in depots doesn't win wars. It took that crisis in France, late summer '44, to really unleash their potential.
Right. The breakout after Operation Cobra was almost too successful. Patton's Third Army, Hodge's First Army, they were moving so fast.
We mentioned 400 miles ahead of supply lines, but let's put that in context. By late August, the leading Allied units were 350 miles away from the beaches where the supplies were actually landing.
And think about what they needed. Fuel, mostly.
Yeah.
The thirst of those armies was unbelievable.
Give us the numbers on fuel consumption again.
Okay, take a Sherman tank. Just one tank burns about 150 gallons of gasoline to go 100 miles. Now multiply that by thousands of tanks, plus 500,000 other vehicles, jeeps, trucks, artillery movers.
The total must have been astronomical.
It was. The Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming over 3 million gallons of fuel every single day. And every drop had to be trucked forward.
And the crazy part is, the reason they had to use trucks was partly their own doing.
Absolutely. The Allied air forces had done a brilliant job before D-Day systematically destroying the French railway network. Bridges, rail yards, marshalling centers, all pounded to rubble.
Why? To stop the Germans moving reinforcements to the invasion beaches, right?
Exactly. And it worked perfectly. The Germans couldn't shift troops quickly. But now, the Allies had inherited a completely shattered rail system. They couldn't use it themselves to move bulk supplies.
Talk about a double-edged sword. They'd crippled the enemy's logistics, and now they were facing the consequences themselves.
Precisely. And the ports weren't much help either. The artificial Mulberry Harbor the Americans built, destroyed in a huge storm back in June.
And Cherbourg, the first big deep-water port they captured.
The Germans had demolished it so thoroughly on their retreat. It took months, literally months, to get it even partially operational. So you had mountains of supplies piling up in Normandy and armies hundreds of miles away, starving for them.
Now, given they knew the CCKW wasn't perfect, remember the British complaints about power and handling, was there ever a moment where Allied command thought, maybe just having lots of OK trucks isn't enough for this big a crisis?
That's a really interesting point. The German philosophy was often about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
Build fewer but superior machines.
Right.
But the American logisticians, guys like Colonel Moses and the Quartermaster Corps, they understood a different reality. A high-tech tank is useless if it's out of gas. The most sophisticated artillery piece is just dead weight without shells.
So availability trumped perfection.
Completely. They had to bet that having overwhelming numbers of adequate trucks could overcome the sheer distance and the lack of infrastructure. They banked on the idea that even if the trucks broke down more often or weren't ideal for every condition, having so many meant they could absorb losses and keep the flow going. Quantity became its own kind of quality in this situation.
And that desperate gamble, that reliance on sheer numbers and adequacy led directly to the Red Ball Express. So things are desperate, Patton's screaming for fuel. Eisenhower needs a solution now. There's an emergency meeting on August 21st, 1944.
Yeah, the top brass gets together and they devise this incredibly ambitious, almost audacious plan. A dedicated, non-stop, high-priority truck convoy system.
And to make it work, they needed trucks. Immediately. Where did they get them?
They basically raided every unit they could find, pulled trucks from artillery battalions, the prime movers for the big guns, took haulers from engineer units, even reassigned ambulances temporarily, whatever it took to assemble a massive fleet.
How many did they manage to scrape together?
They gathered about 6,000 GMC CCKWs, specifically for this continuous operation. Just think about mobilizing that many vehicles almost overnight.
And the name they gave it, the Red Ball Express, it sounds so urgent, so vital. Where did that come from?
It's actually railroad slang from the 1800s in America.
Hmm.
Freight trains carrying high-priority cargo would mark the cars with big red balls. It signaled to everyone else on the line, get out of the way, this shipment takes precedence.
So they just adopted that, painted red balls on signs along the routes in France.
Exactly. And often on the trucks themselves. It was a clear visual signal. This convoy cannot be stopped, cannot be delayed, absolute priority.
And the route system itself was designed for speed, right? Nonstop flow.
That was crucial. They set up 2 parallel one-way loops, a northern route heading east towards the front carrying all the loaded trucks.
And the southern route.
That was for the empties coming back west. Often they'd carry German POWs or salvaged equipment on the return leg. But the key was keeping the traffic flowing in one direction on each road. No oncoming traffic delays.
Who controlled all this, kept things moving?
Military police. MPs were stationed at every major crossroads, every potential bottleneck. Their job was simple: keep the Red Ball trucks moving. Everything else waited. The whole system stretched almost 400 miles eventually.
6,000 trucks running constantly. That needs drivers, a lot of drivers, at least 12,000 just for two-man teams.
More, when you factor in relief drivers and support personnel. And this is where the story takes a critical turn, reflecting the realities of America at the time.
We're talking about segregation in the military.
Yes, the U.S. Army in World War II was strictly segregated. Prevailing racist attitudes and official policy meant that African-American soldiers were largely barred from combat roles.
Where were they assigned instead?
Overwhelmingly to service and support units, things like construction battalions, supply depots, and especially transportation units like the Quartermaster Corps. There was something like 93,000 black soldiers serving in the Quartermaster Corps in Europe alone.
So when the desperate call went out for thousands of truck drivers for this incredibly dangerous, vital mission,
it was primarily these African-American soldiers who answered the call or were assigned to it. Around 17,000 black soldiers became Red Ball drivers.
making up about 3/4 of the total driving force. There were white drivers, too.
Yes, about 3,000 white soldiers also drove, often in separate convoys due to the segregation policies. But the vast majority, the absolute backbone of the driving force, was African American.
And many of these men, they didn't have much truck driving experience before this, did they?
Very little in many cases. They might have been farmhands from Mississippi or factory workers from Detroit. They often got incredibly rushed training, sometimes just a few days before being put behind the wheel of a fully loaded Deuce and a half and told to drive flat out towards the fighting.
The pressure must have been immense, not just the mission, but doing it under the cloud of segregation.
It was what historians call the WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. These soldiers faced discrimination even while performing this essential service.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Reports mention white MPs sometimes harassing black drivers more often for minor rule infractions, or stories of white trucking units being unwilling to help black units that had broken down. It was a constant undercurrent.
Yet they persevered. What motivated them?
Many soldiers explicitly stated they knew their performance was crucial. Doing this incredibly difficult job well, under pressure, was powerful evidence against segregation. It proved their capability, their patriotism, and helped build the case for civil rights back in the United States.
Okay, let's talk about the actual journey. What was it like driving the Red Ball? A round trip took how long?
About 54 hours, nonstop. 2 drivers per truck, supposedly sharing the driving and resting. But often, they both stayed awake for almost the entire run.
54 hours awake, driving a heavy truck. And they weren't exactly sticking to the speed limit, were they?
Not even close. The official limit was 25 miles per hour, partly enforced by governors on the engines. But the drivers knew that wouldn't cut it. Patton needed the supplies yesterday.
So they disabled the governors.
Routinely, they bypassed them, removed them, whatever it took to get more speed. They were pushing these CCKWs with 1940s brakes and suspension, loaded down with tons of cargo up past 60 miles per hour on damaged French roads.
60 miles an hour in a loaded Deuce and a half? At night? Often in blackout conditions. That sounds terrifying.
It was incredibly dangerous. They had these tiny little cat-eye blackout lights that barely eliminated anything. Roads were often cratered from bombing or fighting, sharp turns, plus the constant threat of the odd German plane managing to sneak through and strafe the columns.
And landmines.
Yes, mines were a real danger too, especially on the road shoulders or in potential parking areas where retreating Germans might have left booby traps.
But maybe the biggest enemy wasn't the Germans, but just Sleep. How did they fight exhaustion on that scale?
Sheer willpower played a huge part. Gallons of black coffee, endless cigarettes. But when things got really critical, the sources are clear. The military issued amphetamines, benzodrine tablets.
Speed to keep the drivers awake.
Yeah. It was controversial even then. Doctors knew the risks impaired judgment, long-term effects. But the urgency of the mission, the need to keep the trucks rolling, overrode those concerns. They pushed these men to, and sometimes past, their absolute physical and mental limits.
And that level of exhaustion pushing so hard, it must have led to accidents.
Very high accident rates. Drivers falling asleep at the wheel was a constant problem. Collisions, trucks running off the road into ditches. It was inevitable given the conditions and the lack of sleep. The Army tried to set up relief stations and bring in more drivers, but fatigue was a killer.
What about the trucks themselves? How did the CCKWs hold up under this relentless abuse?
They took an incredible beating. Constant high speeds, overloaded well beyond their rated capacity, running nonstop with almost zero preventative maintenance.
What kinds of failures were common?
Engines overheated constantly, clutches burned out, transmissions were stressed to the breaking point, and tires. The wartime synthetic rubber tires just shredded under the strain. Blowouts were constant.
So the mechanics, many of them also African-American soldiers in the Quartermaster Corps, they must have been working miracles just to keep the fleet moving.
They were unsung heroes, absolutely. Working in terrible conditions, often just under a tarp by the side of the road, in the mud and rain. Scheduled maintenance, oil changes, forget it, there was no time.
It was all about patching things up, field repairs.
Exactly, and this is where the CCKW's inherent simplicity really shone. It was designed to be relatively easy to fix with basic tools.
What kind of improvisations did they have to make?
Incredible stuff. They became masters of scavenging parts from disabled vehicles. If a gasket blew and they didn't have a spare, they might fashion one from layers of paper, maybe a piece of canvas cut to shape, even reportedly from a piece of uniform fabric soaked in oil, whatever worked.
Turning junk into vital components on the fly.
Pretty much. Complex repairs like rebuilding an engine or transmission, impossible in the field. But because the design was straightforward, they could often bypass broken components, patch things together, or swap out entire assemblies like axles or radiators using salvaged parts.
So the simplicity wasn't a flaw, it was actually a strength in this situation.
It was arguably its greatest strength. It meant that even when trucks were technically unfit for service, they could often be kept running. Sources suggest that at times, maybe almost 30% of the Red Ball fleet had significant mechanical problems but were still hauling freight because the mechanics could creatively keep them patched together. That simplicity delivered battlefield endurance.
Okay, so despite the exhaustion, the danger, the mechanical failures, the Red Ball Express worked. It achieved its objective.
It was a staggering success, far exceeding anyone's expectations. The sheer tonnage moved is hard to comprehend.
What was the peak delivery rate?
Just 5 days after it started, on August 29, 1944, the Red Ball convoys delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day.
12,000 tons in one day. By truck?
Yeah. That number just smashed every pre-war logistical calculation the planners had made about how much you could possibly move by road.
And over the entire operation, what was the total?
It ran officially for 82 days until mid-November. In that time, the Red Ball Express hauled a total of 412,193 tons of supplies.
Over 400,000 tons.
And maybe even more impressive is the ton-mile figure. It represents the weight multiplied by the distance. They logged 121 million ton-miles.
Help us visualize that. What's 121 million ton-miles equivalent to?
Okay, think of it like this. It's roughly equivalent to hauling the entire weight of the Empire State Building from Paris all the way to Berlin. That's the scale of the effort, moving enough stuff to keep armies moving forward.
And the soldiers knew how vital it was. You mentioned Private James Rucard.
Yeah, he drove for the 514th Quartermaster Regiment. His quote really captures it. They delivered everything Patton needed, even if you had to drive all day and all night. It wasn't just a job, it was the lifeline.
Even Patton, who wasn't exactly known for praising the support troops, he got it.
He did. He famously called the 2.5-ton truck our most valuable weapon, because he understood the best tank in the world is just scrap metal without fuel. The deadliest artillery is silent without shells. The CCKW delivered the means to fight.
And Eisenhower, did he acknowledge the effort?
Absolutely. In October 44, Eisenhower issued a public message, specifically praising the drivers and the mechanics of the Red Ball, recognizing how critical their unglamorous grinding work had been.
It really highlights the difference in logistical capability between the Allies and the Germans, doesn't it?
Massively. You compare this fleet of over 500,000 standardized American trucks to the German situation. And the Wehrmacht was still heavily reliant on horses. They used something like 2.8 million horses during the war.
2.8 million horses versus 500,000 CCKWs.
And the German truck production was fragmented, limited. They simply couldn't sustain long supply lines the way the Allies could. It became a huge factor, especially on the Eastern Front and later in France.
Did that visible difference in logistics affect German morale?
Definitely. We know from interrogations of captured German soldiers that seeing the seemingly endless columns of American trucks, the sheer volume of supplies moving forward, it was deeply demoralizing. It spoke to an industrial power they simply couldn't match.
So the Red Ball officially ended in November 44. Why then?
Basically, the other systems caught up. Engineers finally got the port of Antwerp open, which was huge, a major deep water port much closer to the front. They also repaired crucial rail lines and laid portable fuel pipelines, like Pio Ludo pipeline under the ocean, across France. Trucks weren't the only option anymore.
But the CCKW and those drivers, they weren't quite done yet, were they? They got called back for one more major crisis.
That's right. Barely a month later, December 1944, Hitler launches his last desperate gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge.
Operation Watch on the Rhine throws the Allies into chaos in the Ardennes forest.
And suddenly there's an urgent need to rush massive amounts of supplies and reinforcements into that sector under the absolute worst winter conditions imaginable.
So they resurrected the express convoy idea.
Instantly. Under different names, like the Little Red Ball or the White Ball Express, but it was the same concept. And crucially, it was largely the same trucks, those reliable GMC CCKWs, and many of the same veteran drivers.
But this time, instead of summer heat, they faced what? Snow, ice.
The worst winter in decades. Freezing temperatures, engines that wouldn't start, icy roads making driving treacherous, frostbite for the drivers in those open cabs. It was brutal.
Yet they kept the supplies flowing to the besieged troops at Bastogne and elsewhere.
They did. They delivered the ammo, the fuel, the medical supplies, the reinforcements that allowed the American forces to hold the line and eventually turn the tide. The Bulge was ultimately won by the soldiers on the ground, but it was sustained by those CCKWs battling the winter.
It really proved the truck versatility and toughness, didn't it? Not just a fair weather vehicle.
Absolutely. It cemented its reputation. Colonel John Eisenhower, Ike's son, later wrote that without the success of these truck operations, first the Red Ball and then during the Bulge, the war in Europe likely would have dragged on well into 1946. The logistical success literally shortened the war.
What about the truck's legacy after the war? Did the CCKW influence other designs?
Oh, definitely. Its basic layout, the 6x6 configuration, the emphasis on simplicity and reliability, it became a template for military trucks globally. The Soviets, for example, who received thousands under Lend-Lease, clearly studied it. You can see the CCKW's influence in their post-war ZIL trucks.
So the lesson was learned worldwide.
Pretty much. The British were technically right about the flaws of the original ACKWX design in 1940, but they were profoundly wrong about what mattered most in total war. It wasn't about having the perfect specs. It was about having something good enough that could be fixed with basic tools and that you could produce in overwhelming numbers. Adequacy and availability beat limited sophistication.
And let's circle back to the drivers one last time. That double victory. They won the logistical battle, but also
They won a crucial battle in the fight for civil rights. Their performance was undeniable proof against the racist arguments used to justify segregation.
they delivered under fire, under pressure, while facing discrimination. That had to count for something back home.
It became powerful ammunition for activists and politicians arguing for desegregation of the military, which finally happened in 1948, and for the broader civil rights movement. Even though many of these veterans returned to a segregated America, faced trouble accessing GI Bill benefits, and dealt with job discrimination, their service on the Red Ball Express was a landmark achievement that couldn't be ignored.
So the GMC CCKW started out dismissed as worthless, ended up proving that real mechanical excellence in wartime isn't about fancy features. It's about reliability under extreme abuse, simplicity for field repair, and the ability to be mass-produced.
Exactly. It was the perfect tool for that specific, desperate moment. And it required that incredible synergy, the industrial power, to churn them out every 7 minutes, coupled with the sheer grit and determination of 17,000 drivers, mostly African-American, who pushed them through hell and back. That combination was truly unbeatable.
It makes you think, doesn't it? We always focus on the headline-grabbing technology, the fighter jets, the tanks, the missiles. Today, maybe it's AI or quantum computing. But history, like the story of the CCKW, often shows it's the simple, reliable, maybe even boring systems that are truly indispensable.
That's a great point. What are the modern equivalents? Maybe it's not a truck. Maybe it's a standardized data protocol or a simple piece of infrastructure software or, like you said, the basic design of a server rack in a data center,
Things we completely take for granted.
right? Things that aren't flashy, maybe even seem a bit outdated or suboptimal on paper. But they work, they're scalable, they're relatively easy to manage or fix, and they form the invisible backbone that allows all the complex headline-grabbing stuff to function. What seemingly worthless or overlooked design is secretly keeping our modern world running right now.
That's definitely something to think about. What's the unglamorous, indispensable deuce and a half of today?